All right, well, good morning. Um, Hello, everyone. Nice to see lots of familiar faces. It's great to visit with you again here in Ottawa on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. So I thank the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation for having me as a guest and for stewarding the lands and waters. It's time immemorial. And I thank the Canadian Internet Society for having me back at Digital Access Day again, this time with a bit of a different hat on. I'm now 2 years into my mandate as at the CRTC as Commissioner for Ontario, based in Toronto. The conference organizers have asked me to talk about the current state of competition among ISPs in Canada and its impact on affordability. I am a CRTC Commissioner, so I will try and speak to that as I can. As you know, promoting competition and investment to deliver reliable, affordable and high quality broadband and mobile services is among the CRTC's core priorities, and it should be. Affordable connectivity is fundamental to social inclusion, to cultural, economic, and financial participation, to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities, to the full spectrum of life in a digital or partly digital society. For most of the history of the CRTC and of its predecessor, the Transportation Commission, as many know better than I, affordable connectivity meant something else. Universal phone service and multiple access points into a single, centralized, highly reliable public switch telephone network that in its later days was fast becoming an integrated services digital network for handling both voice and data. And then came the internet and the World Wide Web. So fast forward, and today, rather than one centralized bulletproof network, digital citizens have become the points of intersection for multiple devices, multiple providers, multiple networks, delivered to multiple and changing locations, all converged around the best efforts internet protocol, and with the ongoing overhang of telephone number identifiers, backup telephone service, and overlapping copper and fiber networks. In 2016, the CRTC recognized this by moving from a telephone universal service to a broadband universal service goal. This wasn't just a change in objectives. We recognized the ground had shifted irreversibly and indicated in our decision that the Commission would begin to shift the focus of its regulatory frameworks from wireline voice services to broadband internet access services. Sounds obvious, but it's also a big shift. PSTN telecom regulation built up complex and interconnected ways of doing things. That shift continues to underlie much of our telecommunications work at the CRTC. So today I want to outline for you some of the ways in which that work has been driving forward in the context of the current state of competition among ISPs in Canada and its impact on the affordability of fixed residential broadband. I will talk about different forms of competition and their impact on pricing and service quality. I'll outline some of the different regulatory work streams that help frame affordability and competition as we oversee it. I want to speak to some of the myths that exist around foreign investment in Canadian telecom markets and to emerging cybersecurity requirements and how these may transform telecommunications sectors. Now, put all of these together, and in some ways the shift from a centralized PSTN, ISDN to a less centralized internet protocol world may sound like a simple one, if not always that much centralized, out with the old, in with the new. But it is the work we do in between the old and the new that helps define where we're headed. It was, of course, the American writer William Faulkner who famously wrote in a novel set between the two world wars that the past is never dead, it's not even past. Perhaps more ominous was the take of the Italian writer Antonio Gramsci, who, writing from prison between the two world wars, said it like this: the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. It is a time of great change and high stakes in the transformation of all of our communications environments as we step more firmly into a digitally native communication and information ecosystem with all that that entails. But as we go about our work, helping steward the connectivity undergirding to this transformation, as against the policy goals set out in the statutes and directions that give me and my colleagues our marching orders, I think we can find a more optimistic take in the words of another famous writer, Northrop Frye, who not long after writing these words would become one of my predecessors as a Toronto-based CRTC commissioner. He wrote, "The fundamental job of the imagination in ordinary life is to produce, out of the society we have to live in, a vision of the society we want to live in." So maybe with a little bit of optimism, we can talk first about competition and affordability. So look, market monitoring analysis of large data sets is an increasingly baseline function for overseeing dynamic markets. So we work with market participants across the industry to collect, analyze, aggregate, publish baseline market information each year. In the past, that has meant publishing annual market reports with narrative charts, graphs, and data. In recent years, we've sort of been working to rebuild this function from the ground up, starting with more detailed open data releases before getting back to the kinds of narratives that you were used to and that hopefully we'll see again. Consult the open data we currently make available, and you'll see that as of the end of 2023, a year ago, about 93% of Canadian households subscribed to internet service out of the 95.5% of households to whom it was available. About 60% of Canadian households subscribe to uncapped 5010 services, about 30% subscribe to fiber. That take-up has marched on, but neither it nor the underlying coverage, of course, were evenly distributed. A year or so ago, there were 735,400 households in Canada that still didn't have uncapped terrestrial 5010 coverage. 688,000 of them are in rural areas, where uncapped 5010 coverage stands much lower at 78.5% of households. On First Nations reserves, that falls to just under 59% of households with coverage, leaving 55,800 households on First Nations reserves that don't have that coverage. So those are target numbers for us, and those are things that we talk about a lot. Let's dig into those fixed residential internet connections now to get at affordability. So by the end of 2023, the average broadband connection was rated at speeds close to half gigabit, representing more than 36% of year-on-year growth. Average data usage for fixed broadband users was more than half a terabyte a month, again, representing 10% year-on-year growth. On the other side of the equation, both revenues and average fixed revenues per user, ARPU, or fixed average revenues per user, were climbing too, but more modestly. So residential fixed ARPU was up to about $70 by the end of 2023, year-on-year growth of just under 3%. Residential fixed revenues on aggregate were up to $12.7 billion in 2023, and that's just over a 5% increase over the previous year. So what does all this say about affordability? Well, we're using more data faster. Part of that, no doubt, things like more video, higher image quality, general ratcheting up of bandwidth expectation. Part of it is that more and more of our home lives, and even more so our mobile lives, are interlaced with digital interaction. The cost of that data per bit is down with decreases across various package levels, but the money spent is up with increases in average household spend. We're paying more and we're using more in a dynamic communications environment. In other words, this is a little different than the change in what it costs to buy lunch, because we don't, hopefully, eat dramatically more each year. How to calculate affordability in a dynamic environment is an ongoing discussion. There are probably different considerations at play for different use cases. It's a discussion that spilled over into some of our proceedings, including the one recently concluded with my colleague's decision on telecommunications in the far north. That decision is now being followed up, by the way, with a proceeding that is currently open for another week on how to implement a subsidy to improve the general affordability of broadband services in the territories and adjacent communities. I invite you to review the notice and to submit any comments you may have. So we've touched on coverage and costs. Let me now layer on a competition baseline. Split those subscriptions and revenues out by platform type, and what we saw at the end of 2023 was this. Incumbent telcos like Bell, Telus, and SaskTel had about 44% of the market. So did incumbent cable carriers like Rogers or Videotron or Eastlink. Non-incumbent carriers accounted for the remaining 11.7%, of which wholesale-based providers were less than half at 5.1%. So there were a few firsts in there in 2023. It was the year that the telcos caught up to the cable codes for overall fixed residential internet market share, pointing to the increasing spread of telco fiber able to match the high speeds that the cable platform with its hybrid fiber and thick coaxial cables are able to attain. So the intensity of that head-to-head incumbent competition continues. At the same time, wholesale-based competition provided by carriers leasing the use of incumbent access lines has dropped and continued to drop. The relative weight of wholesale-based competition, both overall but also as a form of non-incumbent competition, dropped in 2023 too. So another first, it accounted for less than half of non-incumbent market share. Likewise, the overall share of that non-incumbent competition overall, wholesale-based, facilities-based, including independent fiber builders and fixed wireless competitors, fell as well. Now, all of these numbers are moving targets. Many of the wholesale-based subscriptions were internalized by incumbents through acquisition. At the same time, our decisions aim to give competitors a workable way to sell broadband over wholesale fiber access. I'll return to that shortly, which broadens the scope of their potential footprint. So that's a brief snapshot of what our market monitoring program and the open data sets we publish show. The old world continues to birth the new one. Cable carriers continue to deliver very high speeds over combinations of fiber and coax. Telephone carriers continue to operate both copper and fiber networks in parallel. Wholesale-based providers are beginning to operate through those fiber networks. Independent fiber networks, and especially in rural areas, fixed wireless coexist with satellite, including growing take-up of retail low Earth orbit connectivity. Famously, what proportion of residential broadband subscriptions are to foreign-owned telcos these days in Canada as opposed to domestic ones? What proportion is bundled with double or triple play packages as opposed to standalone? How do these match international trends and statistics? You know, there are more questions to ask of the data, and there always are. It's sort of endless. But and it's a conversation I'd love to continue. At the same time, I'd also like to move on to the regulatory framework through which we steward that competition, which operates at different layers and in different ways. At the lowest layers, we try to reduce the barriers to building out networks and through them foster facilities-based competition through regulatory frameworks and ground rules and work streams that cover areas like access on public rights of way, like municipal land, access to communications poles as distinct, of course, from hydro poles, and access to multi-tenant buildings. At the network layer, the wholesale-based competition regime likewise represents a significant ongoing work stream for us that is intended to create space for a different kind of competitive service provision. At the same time, in rural and remote areas, we have for several years now administered a competitor-neutral broadband fund that replaced the old telephone basic service subsidies in high-cost serving areas where there is no market incentive to build out terrestrial broadband, and therefore there is virtually no terrestrial broadband. The broadband fund is therefore another significant work stream for both policy framework and individual funding decisions. Finally, speed testing and resiliency measures, outage reporting help speak to the quality of what is delivered in the marketplace. At the same time, more explicit consumer protection measures around what your ISP must provide, cancellation and switching rules and architectures, a consumer complaints arbitrator, and so on help round out our broad approach to how we oversee competitive broadband markets. So that's a bit of an overview. What I would like to now do is briefly touch on each of these in turn before turning to foreign investment, cyber readiness, and my usual call for you to get involved in our proceedings. So let me start with the lowest layers. Network builds and infrastructure deployment often pose a range of challenges. Some of our active work streams to address these challenges include municipal access agreements and disputes, communications pole access, access to multi-tenant buildings. On municipal access agreements, we have for many years worked with all stakeholders, including municipalities, carriers, and citizens, to help facilitate access to civil works that are needed to build up networks. To assist in this process, we convened parties. It's been a while now, between 2011 and 2013, to develop a model municipal access agreement. Since then, we've continued to be engaged in adjudicating disputes around these agreements and related issues, in developing some of what we put out there as persuasive decisions, and continue to have open files in this work stream even as we speak. The same is true of communications pole access. In 2023, we concluded a comprehensive proceeding with a decision establishing faster timelines for phone companies to provide access to their poles to competitors. Last year, we ran a further consultation on whether we should change the rules that led third parties to attach equipment to poles across Canada, especially in the wireless area. We have yet to issue a decision from this most recent consultation, but of course, any decision we make will continue to promote and balance both greater competition and more investment in networks. We likewise set down fair access rules for communication service provider competition in multi-dwelling units, or MDUs, more than 20 years ago. In 2003, further refining them much more recently in 2021. End users have the right to access the network of their choice. Competitors have the right to install it. Adjudication between buildings and networks that can't agree on the terms for doing so continues to be a very active work stream for us. Those of you who are engaged in the process are very familiar with what I'm talking about. There's always more work to do. We look forward to working with Canadians on finding creative and collaborative solutions to it. Take, for instance, shadow fiber. The unused duct space, sheet space, unlit fiber built by entities like municipalities, utilities, institutions, private businesses for internal use that do not market it for broader commercial use, whether to avoid regulatory risk or because they don't have the human capacity to think about it. What could we do, particularly in rural and remote areas, if we found ways to collaborate or to move or to act consensually in unlocking some of the latent capacity shadow fiber represents? So there's a lot left to do, and really we need lots more networks, and so we're just getting started. Um, Service-based competition. So look, at the network layer, the wholesale-based competition regime likewise represents, as I said, a significant ongoing work stream intended to create space for a different kind of competitive service provision. Over the past 6 months, we've issued a significant decision to give competitors a workable way to sell internet service using the modern fiber networks of large providers across Canada. We've undertaken follow-up rate-setting work, beginning with interim rates which were issued on what competitors will pay for that access. We issued a first decision related to which competitors will have access to that fiber, on which, of course, there remains a proceeding in which our decision is awaited. We continue to work away on all areas related to this work stream. At the same time, since 2019, we've administered a competitively neutral broadband fund that has replaced the old telephone basic service subsidies in rural and remote areas that lack it. So far, we have opened and closed 3 funding calls that build both in and to hundreds of communities, creating modern infrastructure that connects not only residents, but institutions, roads, and in some cases, the communities themselves to long-haul transport of the type needed to support road access to cell phone connectivity, regional development, including the resource extraction areas, and other industries and other forms of economic development. Last December, we issued our first major policy review of the broadband fund, which streamlined and improved the process, we hope, for funding capital projects, including access and transport. Our next steps are to look at funding resiliency improvements, and then gaps in areas like operational costs, which was a focus on the old telephone contribution programs. So I encourage you to look out for those consultation notices as we roll out these policy reviews and to put your ideas and views on the record. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't note the range of consumer protections and regulatory measures we have in place to help steer affordable competition in a direction that is congruent with what Canadians expect from their service providers. Major ISPs are bound by, and all ISPs are expected to follow, an internet code setting out a range of consumer rights and transparency measures. The Consumer Complaints Arbitrator, the CCTS, is in place to help enforce that code and to ensure broader contractual performance. We have rules around cancellations taking effect in a timely manner, a sophisticated set of technical interchange standards which helps ensure not that when you want to change providers, you can ask your new provider to cancel your old service on your behalf, but that all of the correct data flows in the right direction behind the scenes, most of the time, to make it happen. Speed testing and now resiliency measures help speak to the quality of what is delivered in the marketplace. If anything, our work in this area has increased. So periodic speed tests supplement solutions already available from actors in the market like CIRA. To make sure ISPs deliver what's promised, our tied work streams on outage notifications and network resiliency are ongoing with the decision due there, building on some of the rudimentary tools we currently have in place. 4 open proceedings are right now gathering feedback on targeted questions around making it easier to choose and switch your provider, including enhancing self-service mechanisms, improving customer notifications, and other areas. In short, the framework continues to advance, and obviously these are only highlights. The regulatory framework I've sketched out through all of this is largely in the nature of approaches that the Commission has adopted to do the job assigned to us by the Telecommunications Act and by the Cabinet directions that the Act entitles the executive branch of government to issue as a means of steering our work while preserving our separate roles. The CRTC doesn't have a say on mergers and acquisitions in the telecom sector. That falls to the Competition Bureau. The CRTC does not set the rules related to foreign investment. Those are set by Parliament and embedded into the Telecommunications Act itself. However, I'm aware that those foreign investment rules have long been a source of confusion in the marketplace in a way that resurfaces periodically whenever market access to Canadian telecommunication services becomes topical, as it has recently. So I'd like to try and see if I can help clear out some old cobwebs or myths. The Act recognizes, broadly speaking, 2 kinds of telecommunications service provider in Canada, each of which has historically had, at times, different sets of rules. One kind is facilities-based, meaning they own or operate at least one physical network segment in Canada, fiber, copper, cable, radio, whatever, used whether by that carrier or by a third party to provide telecommunication services to the public in Canada for compensation. So we call those carriers. The other kind is non-facilities based, meaning they don't own or operate even one physical network segment in Canada. that's used for public telecom services in Canada. Not fiber, no copper, no coax, not even a radio segment. In the old days of long-distance telephone competition, when the category was invented, the paradigmatic example was the switchless reseller. Generally, we still call these resellers or maybe non-carrier telecom service providers. So let's start with the easy part. The Telecom Act has never put any restrictions on foreign ownership or control of resellers. So during the period when there were restrictions, significant restrictions on foreign ownership or control of facilities-based carriers, the reseller category is the one under which a number of foreign brands came into the market. They simply leased fiber or copper from a third-party Canadian, maybe an established carrier, maybe a more specialized vehicle with which they had a very strong relationship, and entered the market that way. Some of them got to be pretty well known. On the other hand, between 1993 and 2012, all carriers doing business in the Canadian telecom market, in counter-distinction to resellers, had to be Canadian. So for 19 years, an asymmetry between the two categories existed. Non-Canadians could enter and participate in Canadian telecommunications services markets as TSPs, leasing third-party network capacity in order to offer services. What they couldn't do was own or operate the physical network segments underlying those service offerings. That all changed in 2012 when major changes were made to Section 16 of the Telecommunications Act. So among those changes was this: non-Canadians could now own and could now operate a carrier as long as at the time of acquisition it represented less than 10% of the total annual revenues from the provision of telecom services in Canada across all telecom services segments. Once established, these foreign carriers operating in Canada can, of course, continue to invest, continue to acquire other carriers, continue to grow their market share organically beyond that 10% figure. The restriction kicks back in only when it comes to acquiring other carriers once they've grown beyond 10%. So what are we talking about when we talk about 10% of the total annual revenues from the provision of telecom services in Canada across all markets? Well, luckily, most of the numbers are public, so the back of the napkin math is pretty easy to figure out. The CRTC's open data says that for 2023, total telecom revenues were $59.6 billion. So 10% of that is about $5.9 billion. Canada's largest telcos are publicly traded. Do a quick web search on Canadian telecom revenues by company. You'll quickly see that based on publicly reported information, only 3 companies appear to trip that threshold: Bell, TELUS, and Rogers. In other words, short of coming in and taking foreign one of Canada's big 3, the Telecommunications Act has since 2012 allowed foreign investors, including foreign carriers, first of all, to enter the Canadian market, and second of all, to grow their market share to any level. And second of all, along the way, to kickstart the operation by buying up anyone but the big 3 to do it. It's also worth noting that a $5.9 billion threshold, and moving obviously, is nearly triple the highest Investment Canada thresholds at which private sector inbound investments from World Trade Organization partner countries begin to be reviewed. Now, that's not to say there aren't complications on the margins. For instance, although telcos, including since 2012 carriers, can be foreign-owned, non-online broadcasting undertakings, like cable companies, can't be. So a foreign telco that set itself the goal of coming into Canada to get bigger than the big 3 and wanted to start out with a few major acquisitions to do it would have to make sure that their targets divested any television distribution operations to third-party Canadians before they closed the deal. But let's get real. Such divestments take place all the time. They happen every time a small Canadian fiber builder or fixed wireless provider with a TV distribution operation, as many of them have to be able to offer residential customers a full suite of services, signs a deal for significant foreign investment, up to and including an outright sale, as has happened on a number of occasions, in order to finance their next phase of growth and continued building. As those fiber builders and fixed wireless providers know, foreign investment can represent a source of competitive capital investment and a driver of market dynamism. So when you hear someone say that Canadian telecom markets are closed to foreign investment, ask a few more questions. Finally, I'd like to talk briefly about cybersecurity. Late last year, everyone in our sector sat up straight and paid attention to public news stories about what Microsoft did with Salt Typhoon, hacking into and intercepting traffic on the networks of 9 major U.S. telcos, including Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, to list a few, and as I say, intercepting traffic on them. One of the events that closely followed was the U.S. FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, being called on to require telcos to meet baseline cybersecurity requirements, including annual vulnerability testing. Here in Canada, where we have two telecom regulators. We've seen legislative energy around a similar broad framework that would designate ISET as the sectoral regulator for telecom for cybersecurity purposes. Whether or not that legislative energy will bear fruit in a future parliament, baseline cybersecurity requirements are already becoming table stakes for anyone running an ISP. Virtually every regulated sector, from energy to rail to securities, has baseline cybersecurity requirements for sector companies. Telecommunications perhaps should be no different. I know that in general, Canadian telcos are extensively involved in cybersecurity and in key working groups to cooperate and move it forward. We, the CRTC, stand ready to do our part to help ensure that the important goal of sector-wide baselines is achieved. At the same time, there is no reason for any telecom of any size to wait on taking basic practical steps to ensure you're fully secure. So where does that leave us? I've tried to sketch out for you an insider's view of what shifting the focus of our regulatory frameworks from wireline voice to broadband internet has looked like at a time of dynamic change when the past continues to shape our present and our future. The move from a centralized telecom model to a dynamic multi-layered broadband environment is one in which ensuring affordability and competition relies on a range of activities that is equally dynamic and multi-layered. The old world may be struggling to birth a new one, but the interregnum is more than just monsters. To go back to Commissioner Fry, if the job is to produce out of the society we have to live in, a vision of the society we want to live in, then we'll need all of you to continue to be part of that process and show all of us your compelling, achievable, and navigable maps for where we ought to head to achieve the internet we need. We will continue to refine the frameworks that underpin this transformation. I encourage you to engage, to question, and to help shape this future with us. That's what I have to say. They gave me a very long speaking slot. And to be honest, and I hope this won't get me in trouble, but I'm happy to take questions. Maybe lots I can't speak to, but hopefully there's some things that I can. And I guess before I see your hand, so I'll call on you, but the other thing I'll say is, look, I'm not the CRTC. I'm someone who sits on the panels to which I'm in. So, I'm happy to answer your questions and provide whatever insights and clarification I have. You can also spend your time showing me why the CRTC is wrong, but know that at the end of the day, I may well agree with you. Certainly could never say it. And by the way, I know that we're webcasting, so I don't know if there needs to be a mic. Anyway, leave it up to you guys. I'll repeat the question. Or not.
Thank you. I'm a bit curious about how prices for these different internet services, and I'm talking here not about the independent ISPs, but the big ones, the ones that own infrastructure. Do they have to submit something to the CRTC where they present a schedule of costs or something, and then you guys approve that or not?
No.
Oh, I see.
No. And I'll expand a little bit, I guess. So the Telecom Act, the structure of the Telecom Act, which tells us where our job is this. Nobody can offer any telecom service in Canada unless they submit a tariff, which is sort of what you're describing. It also says we have to forbear from requiring a tariff or from regulating in various ways. We have to when there's sufficient competition to protect the interests of users. I can't remember the exact language, and we may forbear when when it's a good idea, in a nutshell, and it would serve the telecom policy goals that we're required to steward. So, a long time ago, we forbore. We said that internet access prices were competitive, and so we said we don't need to have a tariff anymore on the retail side. That's part of the answer to why we don't require tariffs. I guess the other piece is that when we started to mandate wholesale-based competition, we said as an alternative to going back to requiring tariffs for retail, which can be time-consuming and onerous and so on, we'll be able to allow a more flexible marketplace by disciplining their market power in a different way, by enabling competition, by managing the supply of the essential elements that only, or the bottleneck elements perhaps that only they have, which are the access lines. And so we forbore, we didn't re-regulate. And that's one of the reasons we didn't re-regulate. There are some exceptions at the margins. I talked about the broadband fund. So if you're operating a broadband funded project, um, you have to offer internet access at a retail price that is equivalent to that of a major center not too far from the community, sort of designated which those are. But that's a bit of an exception. In general, the answer is no, but that was the long road to explaining why. John?
Hi, it's John Mofford. I'm I'm going to ask you about how proactive you think the commission can be on certain things. So you mentioned salt typhoon. It is inconceivable to me that it didn't also attack Canadian ISPs. Do you think it's within the scope of what CRTC should be doing to get out there and say, we're looking into it and reassure the public and people who work in this industry before they have to come and ask? And the reason why I bring that up is because this happened also with broadband outage, and it happens with people asking questions about connectivity in the north, this sort of thing. I know there's a proceeding ongoing, but is there any scope for pushing the commission further? And I know it seems to be picking up pace, but your view on that would be really interesting.
Yeah, it's a logical question and a difficult one for me to answer. Before I was commissioner, I wrote a piece which talked about with a colleague, which talked about some of the challenges that arise when you have two regulators and you're not sure whose job it is. Those challenges are greater when you have two regulators. One of them says it's my job. Certainly in the draft legislation that was before Parliament, it was very clear about whose job this is. It's not the CRTC's. Does that mean the CRTC shouldn't act? Does that mean that we should have two rates? Like that there's different permutations. I guess that's about as far as I can go in addressing the question. But I think it's certainly an issue of concern to the whole sector, and that's why I made a point of mentioning it in my remarks. And at the end of the day, I think the telcos are whichever the regulator is which acts on that. I mean, we certainly need action. I think that's the important point. And I know that many Canadian telcos are first of all, the largest telcos are very active on cybersecurity. And we have many Canadian telcos which are engaged with cybersecurity in different ways. I guess what I want to underline is the need for every telco to get on. We need a sort of a baseline requirement, and in the same way that whether it's the energy sector, whether it's the rail sector, there's publicly traded securities. All of the companies engaged in all those areas have clear obligations, and I don't see why it should be any different in telecom.
Great to see you. Brent Arnold, it seems like solving the access problem in the north of the country, the default answer seems to have been Starlink for a little while. Given that we've seen what happens with Starlink service when its president doesn't like what a country is doing, i.e. they shut off the taps. I was wondering if that's factoring into the way CRTC is looking at access and what needs to be done in the north to ensure secure internet access.
Yeah, look, we did come out with a significant decision, which I read carefully once it was issued. And I wouldn't say that we're mostly relying on Starlink as the answer. I mean, the decision is in many ways really focused on how to regulate Northwest Tel and build what was incumbent in the north and serving different communities. They've got lots of funding to enhance their network and to bring fiber to the north, which they're doing. There are a lot of other non-Northwest Tel projects that we funded as well out there. And I guess, if anything, we've come under a certain amount of criticism, perhaps, for funding fiber, in places where exactly they should just use Starlink. That's a complex calculus. Looking at things like that, obviously, you're never only talking about residences, you're also talking about businesses and local economic regional economic development, you're talking about roads and cell coverage and the ability to build a broader telecommunications service portfolio. So, but regardless, you know, look, as I've said, Canada is open to foreign competition, and Starlink, you know, didn't require anything special on our side to come into the country, and you know, they're competing here, and that's good for competitive dynamism in Canada. Um, those who subscribe to it, you know, read the same lines on that we do, and hopefully they'll have their choices. But certainly between our decision relating to Northwest Hill and to the far north, our broadband fund and so on, we haven't deferred to Starlink in that way. At the end of the day, we're in a difficult situation, right? We have about 730,000 and counting, probably below 700,000 now households left. And I suppose virtually all of those 700,000 households could rely on Starlink. So, you know, they have a choice, but it's not great to have only one choice. And of course, the quality of what you get with Starlink is limited. It's sort of, you know, do we build roads? We just give people helicopter rides when they call us and say they need one. It's not quite the same thing. So, if I answer the question, but
I don't know if there is an answer, but I appreciate that.
but, you know, and look at the end of the day, they're also I talked about low Earth orbit connectivity, and of course, I was talking about Starlink. There's no one else who does retail LEO. That was not anyone else's business model coming in. Everyone thought Starlink was crazy to try it. It's helped them build. I mean, in a way, they've been buying customers by doing it. It's helped them build critical mass and keep the thing going. And you know, it's like the old joke about, you know, how do you do volume?
Thanks.
This will be our last question.
Thank you very much. So somehow it was decided that pricing was competitive. What would it take for, I suppose we have antitrust and anti-monopoly laws. What would it take to, you know, do some sort of inquiry or about these prices and these corporations? I'm not saying that they are doing it. I'm saying there may be a chance of this happening. So why is this not happening?
I can't speak broadly to your question. I mean, anyone can do any inquiry they like, and they should. In terms of how we work with CRTC, anyone is free to file an application and say, the framework is wrong, you need to change it. Here's the evidence. Here's why the measures you've taken, like mandating wholesale high-speed access, are insufficient to discipline their market power, and you need a different solution. That's, you know, the same way that you might file an application with the court, you would file an application with us, and you're always free to do so.